She fed the baby herself, became the mother the child needed. He came begging for milk for his child. On a bitterly cold November evening, Sarah Mitchell was preparing dinner in her warm kitchen when she heard an urgent knock at her front door. It was just past 7 o'clock, and darkness had already settled over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Sarah wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked toward the door, wondering who would be visiting at this hour. Through the peephole, she could see a man standing on her porch, and even in the dim light, she could tell something was terribly wrong. When Sarah opened the door, the cold air rushed in, but what struck her most was the sound of a baby crying. The man standing before her looked exhausted beyond measure. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty, his hair uncombed, and his eyes carried a weight of desperation that made Sarah's heart clench. In his arms, wrapped in a thin blanket that seemed insufficient for the freezing temperature, was a tiny infant whose cries were weak and heartbreaking. The man's name was Marcus Williams, and he could barely speak through his emotion. His voice cracked as he tried to explain his situation, stumbling over words, while the baby continued to cry in his arms. Sarah noticed his hands were shaking, though whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion she couldn't tell. Marcus explained that he had been walking through the neighborhood for hours, knocking on door after door, hoping someone would help him. Most people had turned him away, some hadn't even opened their doors, and others had threatened to call the police if he didn't leave their property. As Marcus spoke, Sarah's attention kept returning to the baby. The little one couldn't have been more than 3 months old, and even through the crying, Sarah could see that something was seriously wrong. The baby's cheeks looked sunken, her skin had a pale, almost grayish tone, and her cries had that particular quality that Sarah recognized from her work as a lactation consultant. This was a baby who was desperately hungry, possibly dangerously so. Marcus's story came out in broken pieces, interrupted by tears and the baby's wailing. His daughter's name was Emma, he told Sarah. She was 13 weeks old. 2 days ago, his wife Jessica had walked out of their motel room and never came back. She had taken nothing with her except her purse and phone, which she had turned off immediately. Marcus had tried calling her family, but they wanted nothing to do with either of them. He had tried calling friends, but their support had dried up months ago when his financial troubles began. The real crisis, Marcus explained with shame in his voice, was that he had no money for baby formula. He had used his last few dollars 2 days ago, and Emma had been drinking water mixed with a tiny bit of sugar since then because he had nothing else to give her. He had tried going to stores and begging, had attempted to reach out to churches and charities, but it was evening now and everything was closed. He was sleeping in his car with Emma, trying to keep her warm, but she was getting weaker and he was terrified she would die. Sarah didn't hesitate for even a moment. She stepped aside and ushered Marcus and Emma into her home, closing the door against the cold. The warmth of the house seemed to emphasize just how cold Marcus and Emma had been. Sarah could see Marcus's shoulders sag with relief as the heat enveloped them. She guided them to her living room couch and immediately reached for Emma, her professional instincts taking over. As she took the baby from Marcus's arms, Sarah could feel how light Emma was, lighter than she should be for her age. The baby's crying had weakened to a soft whimper, and Sarah knew from experience that this was actually a bad sign. Strong, healthy babies cried loudly when they were hungry. Weak cries meant a baby was running out of energy. Emma's little body felt fragile in Sarah's arms, and her tiny fists moved weakly against Sarah's chest. Sarah called out to her husband David, who emerged from upstairs where he had been helping their children with homework. When David saw the scene in their living room, confusion crossed his face, but Sarah quickly explained the situation in brief, urgent terms. David, always practical, immediately went to the kitchen to see if they had any formula left from when their youngest had been a baby, but Sarah knew they didn't. They had donated it all months ago. While David searched, Marcus collapsed onto the couch, his face in his hands, sobbing. The story continued to pour out of him. He had been a construction worker, he explained, making decent money until 8 months ago when he had been injured on a job site. A beam had fallen on his back, and while the injury wasn't permanently disabling, it had required surgery and months of recovery. During that time, the bills had piled up. Their insurance hadn't covered everything, and without his income, they couldn't keep up with rent. They had been evicted from their apartment 4 months ago. Marcus described how the stress had affected his wife Jessica terribly. She had already been struggling with her pregnancy and then with adjusting to motherhood, and the homelessness had broken something in her. She had become withdrawn, sometimes not speaking for entire days. She had trouble bonding with Emma, would forget to feed her, and Marcus had found himself taking care of both his wife and his baby while trying desperately to find work. His back still hurt, too much for construction, and without a permanent address, getting other work was nearly impossible. Then, 2 mornings ago, Marcus had woken up in their motel room to find Jessica gone. He had managed to scrape together enough money for a few nights in a cheap motel, hoping to give them some stability, but she had vanished. He later found a note she had left in the bathroom, just 3 words, "I can't anymore." Sarah listened to all of this while holding Emma, gently rocking the baby and making soft, soothing sounds. Her mind was racing through options. David returned from the kitchen confirming they had no formula and suggested running to the store, but Sarah looked at Emma's weak condition and knew the baby needed food immediately, not in 30 minutes. That's when Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She was a lactation consultant and had spent years helping mothers with breastfeeding. She had 2 children of her own, Jake, who was 8, and Lily, who was 5. She had stopped breastfeeding Lily just 4 months ago, later than most mothers nursed, but she had always believed in extended breastfeeding when possible. Her body had only recently stopped producing milk, or at least she thought it had. Sarah looked at David and said simply, "I'm going to try to feed her myself." David's eyes widened in surprise, but he saw the determination in his wife's face and the desperate condition of the baby, and he nodded. Marcus looked up, not understanding at first, and when Sarah explained, fresh tears rolled down his face. He opened his mouth as if to protest, to say it was too much to ask, but no words came out. He just nodded, unable to speak through his gratitude and disbelief. Sarah carried Emma to the nursery, the room that had been Lily's when she was a baby and was now used as a playroom. She settled into the rocking chair by the window, the same chair where she had nursed both of her own children hundreds of times. Marcus had followed her to the doorway but stood there uncertainly, and Sarah gently told him he could stay or wait in the living room, whatever made him comfortable. He chose to stay, standing in the doorway, watching as if witnessing a miracle. Getting Emma to latch wasn't easy at first. The baby was so weak and so unused to breastfeeding, having apparently been bottle-fed from birth, that she didn't immediately understand what to do. Sarah had to use all of her professional knowledge and patience, gently encouraging Emma, helping position her correctly, expressing a little milk manually to entice the baby. It took nearly 10 minutes of patient effort, but finally Emma latched on. Sarah wasn't sure if her body would respond. It had been months since she had nursed Lily, and milk production should have stopped. But the body is an amazing thing, and the stimulation of a baby nursing can sometimes restart the process. To Sarah's relief and wonder, she felt the familiar sensation of letdown, the tingling feeling as milk began to flow. Emma, feeling the milk in her mouth, suddenly found new strength and began to suckle more vigorously. The room fell silent except for the soft sounds of Emma nursing. Marcus stood in the doorway, one hand over his mouth, tears streaming down his face as he watched a complete stranger feed his daughter. Sarah rocked gently, looking down at the tiny baby in her arms, and felt a wave of emotion she hadn't expected. This wasn't her baby, but in this moment, providing this most fundamental act of care, she felt connected to Emma in a profound way. Emma nursed for nearly 20 minutes before falling asleep, finally satisfied and peaceful. Her tiny face relaxed, the stress lines that had seemed wrong on such a young baby's face smoothing out. Sarah continued to hold her, not wanting to disturb the peaceful sleep, and Marcus finally stepped into the room, kneeling beside the rocking chair. He tried to thank Sarah, but words seemed inadequate. How do you thank someone for possibly saving your child's life? How do you express gratitude for a kindness so intimate and selfless from a complete stranger? Marcus could only whisper thank you over and over, and Sarah, still holding sleeping Emma, told him gently that any mother would have done the same, though they both knew that wasn't true. Many doors had been closed to him that night. David appeared with blankets and pillows, having made up the guest room for Marcus and Emma. He had also prepared some food for Marcus, who admitted he hadn't eaten in 2 days, having given what little he had to try to feed Emma. That night, for the first time in months, Marcus slept in a real bed, in a warm room, with his daughter fed and safe beside him in a borrowed bassinet that David had retrieved from the attic. Sarah lay awake in her own bed that night, David sleeping beside her, and wondered what she had just set in motion. She had acted on instinct and compassion, seeing a need and filling it without thought for consequences. But now, in the quiet darkness, questions filled her mind. What would happen tomorrow? Would Marcus take Emma and disappear into the night? Would this be a single act of emergency help, or had she just taken on something much bigger? She didn't have answers, but as she drifted towards sleep, she knew one thing with certainty. She had done the right thing. Whatever came next, she would face it, because no baby should cry from hunger when someone had the ability to help. The next morning, Sarah woke up early, as she always did, but this time with an unusual awareness that there were guests in her home. She could hear movement downstairs and found Marcus in the kitchen, looking uncomfortable and uncertain. He had clearly been awake for a while, perhaps afraid to make noise or touch anything in someone else's home. Emma was cradled in his arms, awake but quiet, her big eyes looking around at the unfamiliar surroundings. Sarah greeted them warmly and immediately reached for Emma, checking the baby over with the practiced eye of both a mother and a healthcare professional. Emma looked better than she had the night before. There was slightly more color in her cheeks, and her eyes seemed more alert. Sarah asked Marcus if Emma had woken during the night, and he admitted she had, around 3 in the morning, crying with hunger. He had walked her around the guest room for an hour, trying to soothe her, terrified to wake Sarah and her family but not knowing what else to do. Sarah's heart ached hearing this. She told Marcus firmly but kindly that if Emma needed to eat, he should wake her, no matter what time it was. Babies couldn't wait, and Sarah had spent many years waking up at all hours for her own children. One more baby needing night feedings was nothing new to her. She settled into a kitchen chair and began nursing Emma right there while Marcus watched, still seeming amazed that this was happening. While Emma ate, Sarah and Marcus talked more calmly than they had been able to the night before. Marcus shared more details about his life, and Sarah began to understand the full scope of his situation. He had grown up in foster care himself, never knowing his real parents, and had aged out of the system at 18 with little support or guidance. He had managed to find work in construction and had actually been doing well for himself until he met Jessica at a community college where he was taking night classes to get his diploma. Jessica had come from a difficult family situation too. Her parents were divorced and wanted little to do with her, and she had been supporting herself since she was 17. She and Marcus had bonded over their shared experiences of having to survive on their own. They had married quickly, perhaps too quickly, both hoping to create the family neither of them had ever really had. When Jessica became pregnant, they had been happy at first, excited even, despite their modest financial situation. But pregnancy had been hard on Jessica both physically and mentally. She had suffered from severe nausea for months, had difficulty working, and became increasingly anxious and depressed. Marcus had tried to support her, taking extra shifts and overtime, but then his injury had happened. The accident at work had come at the worst possible time, just 2 months before Emma was born. Suddenly, instead of preparing happily for their baby, they were scrambling to survive. After Emma's birth, things had gotten even worse. Jessica had shown signs of what Marcus now understood was postpartum depression, though at the time he hadn't known what to call it. She would stare at walls for hours, barely responding when spoken to. She had difficulty caring for Emma, sometimes forgetting to feed her until the baby's cries became desperate. Marcus found himself doing everything while also dealing with his own physical pain and the stress of their financial collapse. The eviction had been the breaking point. Having to pack up their small apartment, losing most of their belongings because they had nowhere to store them, and then living in their car had pushed Jessica into an even darker place. But she had become almost silent, moving through days like a ghost. The motel room had been Marcus's attempt to give them some dignity and stability, using money he had borrowed from a former coworker. But it hadn't been enough to save Jessica's deteriorating mental state. Sarah listened to all of this while Emma continued to nurse, the baby now eating more strongly than she had the night before. Sarah's professional mind was working, thinking about what Emma needed medically, but her heart was breaking for this young family, torn apart by circumstances and lack of support. She asked Marcus if he had tried to find Jessica, and he explained that he had filed a missing person report with the police, but they had told him that adults had the right to leave, and unless there was evidence of danger, they couldn't force someone to come back. After Emma finished nursing and fell asleep, Sarah prepared breakfast for Marcus. He ate slowly, as if his stomach had forgotten what real food felt like. David came downstairs with Jake and Lily, both children curious about the visitors. Sarah had briefly explained the night before that someone needed help, and her children had grown up understanding that their mother believed in helping others. Jake and Lily peeked at baby Emma with interest, and Lily asked if they could keep her. The innocent question made Marcus's face crumble, and he excused himself to the bathroom to compose himself. David pulled Sarah aside while the children ate their cereal and asked quietly what the plan was. It was a fair question. They both had to work, they had their own children to care for, and while helping for one night was one thing, the situation clearly needed more than temporary assistance. Sarah admitted she didn't have a plan, but she couldn't send Marcus and Emma back to living in a car, especially not now that she had seen how desperate their situation was. That morning became a pattern that would repeat for days, then weeks. Marcus prepared to leave after breakfast, thanking Sarah profusely and promising to figure something out. But Sarah stopped him and asked when Emma would need to eat again. "In a few hours," Marcus admitted. Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She told Marcus to come back at lunchtime, that she worked from home most days doing consultations online and could feed Emma again then. Marcus's relief was visible, but so was his shame. He didn't want to be a burden, he explained. He was trying to find work, trying to get assistance, but everything moved so slowly and required paperwork and identification and addresses he didn't have. Sarah understood more than he might have expected. Through her work, she had seen many families struggling, had witnessed how easily people could slip through the cracks of social services, especially people who had started with so little to begin with. So Marcus left that morning, but he returned at noon and then again in the evening. Each time Sarah fed Emma, and each time the baby seemed a little stronger, a little healthier. Between feedings, Sarah made phone calls on Marcus's behalf. She contacted social services, trying to navigate the complicated system to get him assistance. She reached out to local charities and churches, looking for resources. She discovered that emergency housing had long waiting lists, that food assistance required documentation Marcus didn't have readily available, and that the system designed to help people often seemed designed to frustrate them instead. By the end of the first week, a routine had developed almost without conscious decision. Marcus would arrive early in the morning, and Sarah would feed Emma. He would leave to look for work or attend appointments at various agencies, and return at midday for another feeding. Sometimes he made it back for an evening feeding, sometimes he called to say he was stuck somewhere without transportation and couldn't make it, and Sarah would pump milk and save it for him to pick up later. Sarah's own children adapted to the new routine with the flexibility of youth. Jake, at 8 years old, took a protective interest in baby Emma, always wanting to help hold her or fetch things for his mother. Lily, at 5, treated Emma like a living doll, fascinated by the tiny baby and wanting to be involved in everything. Both children asked questions about why Emma's daddy couldn't feed her himself, and Sarah explained in simple terms about breastfeeding and how sometimes mommies helped other mommies when babies needed it. David was less comfortable with the situation as it stretched from days into weeks. He supported his wife's compassion, he truly did, but he worried about the impact on their family. Their grocery bills increased as Sarah ate more to support milk production, and as Marcus often stayed for meals. Their privacy was diminished with someone coming and going from their home multiple times daily. David worked long hours as an accountant, and he came home wanting peace and family time, but instead found their living room often occupied by Marcus and Emma. The tension in Sarah and David's marriage began to show in small ways. David would make comments about needing to set boundaries. Sarah would respond defensively, asking if he wanted her to let a baby starve. They had always been a strong couple, united in their values and parenting, but this situation tested them in unexpected ways. David felt his concerns were reasonable, Sarah felt her actions were necessary, and neither was entirely wrong. Meanwhile, Sarah learned more about Marcus through their daily interactions. She discovered he was actually quite intelligent, having taught himself many things despite his difficult upbringing. He was good with his hands, fixing a broken cabinet door in Sarah's kitchen one day without being asked, and repairing a wobbly table leg another time. He was trying to contribute however he could, clearly uncomfortable with accepting charity without giving something back. But Sarah also began to notice troubling signs. Some days Marcus seemed energetic and hopeful, talking about job leads and plans for the future. Other days he was withdrawn and quiet, barely speaking, his eyes dull. One evening he arrived smelling of alcohol, though he wasn't drunk, and Sarah felt alarm bells ringing in her mind. When she gently asked about it, Marcus broke down, admitting he had stopped at a bar, bought one beer with money he shouldn't have spent, and sat there for an hour trying to escape his thoughts. He confessed to Sarah that he was struggling with depression, probably had been for months but hadn't wanted to admit it. He was terrified constantly about Emma's future, guilty about Jessica's disappearance, ashamed of his situation, and scared that at any moment Emma would be taken away from him by Child Protective Services. The alcohol had been a momentary weakness, he insisted, a mistake he wouldn't repeat. Sarah believed him but also filed the information away, knowing she needed to be watchful. By the third week, Emma had transformed from the weak, pale baby Sarah had first held to a healthy, thriving infant. Her cheeks had filled out, her skin glowed with good health, and she was reaching the developmental milestones appropriate for her age. She smiled now, gurgled happily, and showed clear recognition when Sarah held her. The transformation was remarkable and gratifying, proof that all Sarah was doing was making a real difference. But the question remained, what happened next? Marcus was making progress with social services, but slowly. He had applications pending for housing assistance that might take months to process. He was doing odd jobs for cash when he could find them, but nothing stable or sufficient to support himself and Emma. He was still sleeping in his car most nights, though Sarah had started insisting he stay in their guest room several nights a week, especially when the weather was particularly cold. One evening, after putting Emma down for a nap in the portable crib they now kept set up in the guest room, Marcus sat with Sarah and David in their living room. He tried to express his gratitude, but words failed him as they had so many times before. How could he possibly thank them adequately? Sarah assured him that seeing Emma healthy was thanks enough, but they all knew the situation couldn't continue indefinitely in its current form. David, always the practical one, suggested they needed to think about long-term solutions. He wasn't unkind in his approach, but he was realistic. Marcus needed stable housing and income. Emma needed consistent care. Something had to change. Marcus agreed completely, but the problem was that Changing circumstances took time and resources he didn't have. He was caught in an impossible situation where he needed stability to get help, but needed help to achieve stability. That night, after Marcus had left with Emma for another night in his car, despite Sarah's offer of the guest room, he said he needed to maintain some independence and dignity. Sarah lay awake thinking. She had started this journey by answering a knock at her door and making an immediate decision to feed a hungry baby. She had thought it would be a one-time thing, a single act of emergency assistance, but it had grown into something much bigger, something that was affecting her entire family and her daily life. Yet when Sarah thought about stopping, about telling Marcus he needed to find another solution, she physically couldn't imagine it. Emma had become attached to her, clearly recognizing and preferring Sarah to anyone else except Marcus. Sarah had bonded with Emma in a way she hadn't anticipated, that deep maternal connection that comes from providing such intimate care. The thought of Emma going hungry again, or being cared for by strangers, made Sarah's chest tighten with anxiety. She wondered where this path was leading. She wondered if Marcus would ever truly get back on his feet. She wondered what had happened to Jessica and if she would ever return. She wondered how long her own family could sustain this arrangement before something broke. But most of all, as she finally drifted to sleep, she wondered if she had the strength to see this through to whatever end awaited them, because turning back now seemed impossible. Emma needed her, and Sarah had never been able to turn away from someone who needed her, especially not a helpless baby who had already claimed a piece of her heart. As winter settled in with full force, the arrangement between Sarah's family and Marcus with baby Emma became more complex and more deeply intertwined with their daily lives. What had started as emergency help had evolved into something that felt almost like co-parenting, though nobody quite knew how to name or define it. The guest room in Sarah's house now had Emma's things permanently stored there. Diapers, clothes that Sarah had bought or received from friends, toys, and the portable crib that was set up and ready whenever they needed it. Marcus was now staying at Sarah's house 4 or 5 nights each week. It had happened gradually, without any formal discussion or agreement. A particularly cold night would prompt Sarah to insist he stay. Then Emma would have a restless night, and it made sense for Marcus to be there in the morning. Then Marcus would have an early appointment nearby, and staying over just made practical sense. Before anyone quite realized it, Marcus had become something like a temporary member of the household. Sarah's children had fully embraced Emma as part of their lives. Jake had taken on the role of protective big brother, always wanting to hold Emma and make her laugh. He would rush home from school eager to see if the baby was there, disappointed on days when Marcus had taken her elsewhere. Lily was equally attached, treating Emma like her own living baby doll, wanting to help with everything from diaper changes to choosing Emma's outfits from the growing collection of baby clothes. The children's attachment worried David more than it seemed to worry Sarah. One evening, after the kids were in bed, David tried to express his concerns to his wife. He pointed out that Emma wasn't their child, that Marcus could leave at any time and take her away, and that Jake and Lily were getting too attached to a situation that couldn't last forever. Sarah understood his concerns intellectually, but emotionally she felt differently. She argued that teaching their children compassion and generosity was important, that showing them how to help others in need was a valuable life lesson. But David's concerns went deeper than just the children's attachment. He worried about their finances, which had taken a noticeable hit. Sarah was buying formula to supplement when she couldn't nurse, purchasing diapers and baby supplies, and their food costs had increased significantly with an extra adult in the house regularly. David had always been the more financially cautious one in their marriage, and he could see their savings slowly declining. When he tried to discuss this with Sarah, she became defensive, asking if he was putting a price on helping a baby in need. These conversations often ended in arguments, something that had been rare in their marriage before Marcus and Emma entered their lives. David felt like Sarah wasn't listening to his legitimate concerns. I felt like David was being cold and unsympathetic. Both were frustrated, and neither quite knew how to bridge the gap that seemed to be growing between them. The stress was showing in small ways: shorter tempers, less patience with each other, fewer of the small, affectionate gestures that had always characterized their relationship. Meanwhile, Sarah was learning more about Marcus's past and present struggles. Through their daily interactions and long conversations during Emma's nap times, Marcus opened up about his childhood and foster care. He had been moved between 7 different homes before aging out of the system. Some homes had been okay, some had been neglectful, and one had been actively harmful in ways Marcus didn't want to detail. He had learned early not to trust that any good situation would last, not to get attached to people or places because everything was always temporary. This explained so much about Marcus's behavior, Sarah realized. His difficulty accepting help, his constant apologies, his inability to plan for the future, these were all survival mechanisms from a childhood where stability was a fantasy. Sarah's heart ached for the boy Marcus had been and for the man he was trying to become despite everything working against him. She understood now why he was so desperate to keep Emma, to not let her enter the foster system that had failed him so completely. Marcus was making efforts to improve his situation, and Sarah helped however she could. She accompanied him to appointments at social services, helping him navigate the confusing paperwork and requirements. She helped him apply for job training programs and connected him with a local employment agency. She even wrote letters of reference for him, testifying to his character and work ethic based on what she had observed in her own home. But progress was achingly slow. The housing assistance waiting list was months long. The job training programs had limited spots and specific requirements. Every step forward seemed to require documentation Marcus didn't have or qualifications he didn't meet. Sarah found herself increasingly frustrated with a system that seemed designed to keep people down rather than help them up. She had never fully understood how difficult it was for people without resources to access help until she was walking through it alongside Marcus. There were good days when hope seemed reasonable. Marcus got a part-time job doing maintenance work at a small apartment complex. It didn't pay much, but it was legitimate work with a regular schedule. He was so proud the day he received his first paycheck, and he immediately went out and bought groceries to contribute to Sarah's household. Sarah had to fight back tears at the gesture, understanding how much dignity that small act of contribution meant to him. But there were also difficult days that revealed the depth of Marcus's struggles. Sarah came home one afternoon to find Marcus sitting in her backyard in the cold, Emma bundled up and sleeping in his arms, while he stared at nothing with empty eyes. When Sarah approached him concerned, Marcus admitted he had been having dark thoughts, feeling like Emma would be better off without him, that he was dragging everyone down. Sarah was alarmed and immediately sat with him, talking him through the moment and making him promise to tell her when he felt this way. She realized then that Marcus was dealing with serious depression, probably had been for a long time, and needed professional help. She researched free and low-cost mental health services in their area and found a clinic that offered sliding-scale counseling. She helped Marcus make an appointment and even offered to watch Emma so he could attend. Marcus went to his first counseling session with visible reluctance, but came back admitting it had helped to talk to someone. However, Sarah also began noticing signs that worried her deeply. Some evenings Marcus would return smelling of alcohol, claiming he had only had one beer but his eyes telling a different story. Other times he would disappear for several hours without explanation, leaving Emma with Sarah but not saying where he was going. When Sarah asked about these absences, Marcus became evasive or defensive, and Sarah didn't push too hard, afraid of damaging their fragile arrangement. One night, around 3 months into their arrangement, David confronted Sarah with a hard truth. He had been patient, he said, and he supported helping people in need, but their marriage and their family were suffering. They barely talked anymore without arguing. They hadn't had a date night or quality time together in months. Their children were asking why Daddy seemed angry all the time. Something had to change. Sarah knew David was right, but she felt trapped. She couldn't abandon Marcus and Emma now, not when they depended on her so completely. Emma was thriving under her care, gaining weight appropriately, hitting all her developmental milestones, clearly bonded to Sarah in a deep way. When Emma saw Sarah, her whole face lit up with joy. When Sarah held her, Emma relaxed completely, content and secure. How could Sarah walk away from that? The tension in the household became palpable. But Sarah found herself caught between her husband and her conscience, between her own children's needs and Emma's needs, between her marriage and her sense of moral obligation. She started having trouble sleeping, lying awake at night trying to figure out solutions that would satisfy everyone, knowing that no such perfect solution existed. Things came to a crisis point one Sunday afternoon. Marcus had stayed over Saturday night, and the whole household was home together. Jake and Lily were playing with Emma in the living room, while Marcus watched them smiling at their gentleness with the baby. David was in the kitchen preparing lunch, and Sarah was folding laundry. On the surface, it looked like a peaceful domestic scene, almost like an extended family gathering. But then David's phone rang. It was his mother, calling for their weekly chat, and during the conversation, she asked how things were going. David stepped into his home office for privacy, but Sarah could hear his voice through the door, and what she heard made her heart sink. David was telling his mother about the situation with Marcus and Emma, and his frustration was clear in his voice. He told her he felt like a stranger in his own home, that his wife cared more about a stranger's baby than about their marriage, that he didn't know how much more he could take. Sarah stood frozen in the hallway, arms full of laundry, as she heard her husband's pain and frustration laid bare. She had been so focused on Emma's needs and Marcus's struggles that she hadn't fully acknowledged how much this was costing David, costing their marriage. Tears began streaming down her face as she realized the impossible position she had put her family in. Later that evening, after Marcus had taken Emma and left for the night, Sarah and David had their most honest and difficult conversation since this whole situation began. David admitted he resented Marcus's presence in their home, resented the time and energy Sarah devoted to Emma, resented feeling like his opinions and feelings didn't matter. He wasn't proud of these feelings, he said, but they were real and they were affecting everything. Sarah acknowledged all of this through her own tears. She admitted she had been unfair to David, had dismissed his concerns too easily, had prioritized helping Marcus and Emma over maintaining her marriage. But she also tried to explain something she had trouble putting into words. The bond she felt with Emma went beyond logic or reason. She had nourished this baby with her own body, had brought her back from the edge of serious malnutrition, had become attached in a way that felt almost biological. They talked late into the night, long after they normally would have been asleep. They aired grievances and frustrations that had been building for months. They cried together and held each other and tried to find some path forward that honored both David's legitimate needs and Sarah's deep commitment to Emma's welfare. It was painful and exhausting, but it was also necessary. By the end of the conversation, they had reached some agreements. They would set clearer boundaries around Marcus's presence in their home. They would have designated family-only evenings when Marcus wouldn't visit. Sarah would make more effort to prioritize her marriage and her own children. They would revisit the situation in a month and honestly assess whether it was sustainable, but they both also acknowledged something else. The situation was unlikely to resolve itself neatly. Marcus was making progress, but slowly, too slowly to see an endpoint in the near future. Emma was thriving but remained dependent on Sarah's care. They were all caught in something that had taken on a momentum of its own, and nobody quite knew how to stop it or where it was heading. That night, Sarah lay in bed next to David, holding his hand in the darkness. She felt the weight of all the competing demands on her heart and her time. She loved her husband and didn't want to lose him. She loved her children and didn't want them to suffer. But she also loved Emma in a way she couldn't deny, and she couldn't imagine abandoning her. She was one person trying to be everything to everyone, and she was discovering that maybe that wasn't possible. Maybe something would have to break. She just hoped that when it did, they would all survive it intact. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, 6 months after Marcus had first knocked on Sarah's door. Sarah was at the grocery store, Emma strapped into the shopping cart seat, contentedly playing with her toes while Sarah picked out vegetables. Marcus had asked if Sarah could watch Emma while he went to a job interview, one that actually seemed promising, a full-time position with benefits at a local warehouse. Sarah had been happy to help, hopeful that this might be the break Marcus needed. When her phone rang and she saw it was an unknown number, Sarah almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up, and the voice on the other end made her blood run cold. It was a police officer asking if she knew Marcus Williams. Sarah's heart began pounding as she confirmed that yes, she knew him. The officer explained that Marcus had been pulled over for a broken taillight, and during the stop, the officer had smelled alcohol. Marcus had failed a field sobriety test and been arrested for driving under the influence. Sarah felt the world tilt around her. Her first thought was relief that Emma hadn't been in the car. The officer confirmed that Marcus had been alone. Her second thought was devastation for Marcus, who had been doing so much better lately, or so she had thought. Her third thought was fear about what this meant for Emma's future. She thanked the officer for calling, her voice shaking, and stood in the middle of the grocery store aisle trying to process what she had just heard. Looking down at Emma, who smiled up at her innocently, Sarah felt a wave of protective fury. How could Marcus have been so reckless? How could he have been drinking and driving when he had a job interview, when he had a daughter depending on him? When he had been making progress? She abandoned her half-full shopping cart and drove straight home, her mind racing with questions and concerns. The rest of that day passed in a blur of phone calls and anxiety. Sarah learned that Marcus was being held at the county jail, that his bail was set at an amount he couldn't possibly pay, and that he was facing serious charges. Because he had a prior minor offense from years ago, this wasn't treated as a first-time mistake. The court took it very seriously. Sarah felt torn between anger at Marcus for his poor choices and sympathy for someone who was clearly struggling more than he had let on. That evening, when David came home from work, Sarah had to tell him what had happened. She could see in his face a mixture of emotions, concern, frustration, and something that looked almost like resignation. David asked the question that had been haunting Sarah all afternoon. What happens to Emma now? Sarah didn't have an answer. She had called the police station trying to get information, but they had told her that Child Protective Services had been notified and would be handling Emma's placement. The call from CPS came the next morning. A caseworker named Mrs. Chen explained that Emma was currently considered a child in need of protective services. With Marcus in jail and unable to care for her, and with Emma's mother's whereabouts still unknown, the state would need to place Emma in emergency foster care. Mrs. Chen was professional but kind as she explained the process. She would need to come pick up Emma later that day. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. The thought of handing Emma over to a stranger, of this baby who had been in her care for 6 months going to an unfamiliar home, was unbearable. Emma knew Sarah, trusted Sarah, had been thriving under Sarah's care. How could Sarah just hand her over to the foster system that had failed Marcus so completely? The words came out of Sarah's mouth before she had fully thought them through. What if I want to take her? What if I want to foster her? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Mrs. Chen explained that while it was possible, it wasn't a simple process. Sarah would need to go through the full foster parent certification process, background checks, home studies, training classes, references, and more. It could take weeks or even months, but Mrs. Chen also said something that gave Sarah hope. Because Emma was already in Sarah's care and doing well there, and because Sarah had a relationship with the child's father, even if informal, there might be a possibility of an emergency placement while Sarah went through the certification process. It wasn't guaranteed, but Mrs. Chen said she would look into it and call back. After hanging up, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with Emma in her lap and tried to process what she had just committed to. She had offered to become Emma's foster parent, potentially to take on legal responsibility for this child, without even discussing it with David first. She knew this was a huge decision, one that would affect their entire family, and she had just made it unilaterally in a moment of panic and protectiveness. When David came home for lunch, Sarah told him what she had done. She braced herself for anger or accusations, but instead, David just looked tired. He sat down across from her, looked at Emma, who was happily playing with a rattle, and asked Sarah a simple question. Are you prepared for what this means? Really prepared? Sarah tried to answer honestly. She knew it meant more expenses, more time commitment, more stress. It meant dealing with the foster care system, with court dates and caseworkers and regulations. It meant that their family would change fundamentally, that their life would become even more complicated than it already was. But looking at Emma, thinking about this baby going to strangers, Sarah knew she couldn't let that happen. She had already become Emma's mother in every way that mattered except legally. David was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said something that surprised Sarah. I've seen how you are with her. I've seen how Jake and Lily are with her. And as frustrated as I've been with this whole situation, I can't imagine just sending her away either. But Sarah, if we do this, if we really commit to this, then we need to do it right. No more just making it up as we go. We need a real plan, real boundaries, and we need to protect our family while we help Emma. They spent the next several hours talking through what foster care would mean. They looked at their finances and realized it would be tight but manageable, especially since foster parents received a monthly stipend to help with expenses. They talked about how to explain this to Jake and Lily in a way that was honest but age-appropriate. They discussed what it would mean for their marriage, already strained by the events of the past months, and committed to making time for each other and for counseling if needed. Mrs. Chen called back late that afternoon with unexpected news. She had reviewed Emma's case and Sarah's situation, and based on Emma's current well-being and the existing relationship, she was approving an emergency placement. Sarah could keep Emma while going through the foster certification process, which would need to be completed within 60 days. There would be frequent home visits, and Sarah would need to start the training classes immediately, but Emma could stay. Sarah felt relief wash over her so intensely she had to sit down. Emma wouldn't be taken away. They had time to figure this out properly. She thanked Mrs. Chen profusely, and after hanging up she held Emma close and cried tears of relief and fear and overwhelming emotion. David wrapped his arms around both of them, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt like she and her husband were truly on the same page. The next several weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah attended foster parent training classes 3 evenings a week, learning about trauma-informed care, dealing with birth families, and navigating the foster system. David took time off work to watch the children during these classes, and Jake and Lily adapted to the new routine. The home study process was invasive and thorough. Caseworkers examined every aspect of their lives, their home, their finances, and their relationships. During this time, Sarah also maintained contact with Marcus through phone calls and one jail visit. Marcus was devastated by what had happened. He explained through tears that he had been struggling more than he had admitted, that the pressure and stress had become overwhelming, and that he had made a terrible mistake. He had been drinking the night before the job interview, intending to stop, but had woken up late and panicked, driving to the interview despite knowing he probably shouldn't. The job opportunity was gone, obviously. Marcus was facing jail time, possibly several months. His lawyer had explained that because of his previous record and the seriousness of the offense, the judge was unlikely to be lenient. Marcus was broken, defeated, convinced he had ruined everything. Sarah tried to reassure him that Emma was safe and cared for, but Marcus's guilt was overwhelming. He kept saying Emma deserved better than him, that she was better off without him. Sarah visited Marcus in jail one afternoon, having arranged for David to watch Emma. Sitting across from Marcus in the cold, institutional visiting room, separated by plexiglass and talking through phones, Sarah saw a man who had given up. Marcus told her he had been thinking a lot during his time in jail, and he believed the kindest thing he could do for Emma was to let her go. He said he wanted Sarah to adopt Emma, to give her the stable family and life he could never provide. Sarah was stunned. She had expected Marcus to be upset, to be fighting to get Emma back, not offering to give up his parental rights. She tried to tell him not to make any permanent decisions while in crisis, that things might look different once he was out and had completed rehabilitation, but Marcus was firm. He said he had finally realized what his counselor had been trying to tell him, that loving Emma meant wanting what was best for her, even if that wasn't him. The conversation left Sarah emotionally drained. Part of her understood Marcus's logic. Emma was thriving in Sarah's home, bonded to the family, and Sarah could provide stability Marcus might never achieve, but another part of her grieved for Marcus, for the loss of his dream of raising his daughter, for the tragedy of a system that had failed him as a child and was now failing him as a father. Over the following weeks, Sarah completed her foster certification. The home study was approved, and Emma officially became their foster child. Sarah had to explain to Jake and Lily what fostering meant, that Emma might be with them for a long time, or that things might change, but that right now she was part of their family and they would love and care for her. The children accepted this with the flexibility of youth, just happy that Emma was staying. Marcus's court date arrived, and he was sentenced to 9 months in jail with the possibility of early release for good behavior. Additionally, he was required to complete substance abuse treatment and counseling. His lawyer had negotiated the sentence down from what it could have been, but it was still significant time. During the sentencing, Marcus stood before the judge and said something that Sarah, sitting in the courtroom to support him, would never forget. Marcus said, "I know I messed up. I know I let my daughter down. But I want to do one thing right. I want to make sure she has the life she deserves. The woman who's fostering her, she's been more of a parent to Emma than I ever managed to be. I'm asking the court to support me in voluntarily relinquishing my parental rights so that Emma can be adopted by someone who can actually take care of her." The courtroom was silent. The judge looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed sympathy and sadness, and said that any decisions about parental rights would be handled through the family court system, but that she respected Marcus's desire to prioritize his child's welfare. Sarah sat in the courtroom, with tears streaming down her face, her heart breaking for Marcus even as a small, guilty part of her felt hope at his words. After the sentencing, Sarah stood outside the courthouse in the spring sunshine trying to process everything that had happened. 6 months ago, she had answered a knock at her door and fed a hungry baby. Now she was a foster parent, possibly on the path to adoption, and a man she had come to care about was in jail, voluntarily giving up his daughter because he believed it was the right thing to do. Her life had been completely transformed in ways she never could have imagined. That evening, Sarah sat with David after the children were all asleep, Emma included. They held hands and talked about what came next. If Marcus followed through with relinquishing his rights, and if Emma's mother never returned or also relinquished rights, adoption would become possible. Their family of 4 could become a family of 5. It was terrifying and exciting and sad all at once. David admitted that his feelings about the situation had evolved. He had been resistant and resentful, but watching Sarah with Emma, watching Jake and Lily love their foster sister, he had come to see Emma as part of their family too. It wouldn't be easy, he said, and there would still be hard days and challenges ahead, but they would face them together. Sarah squeezed his hand gratefully, knowing how much David was sacrificing, how much he was stretching to accommodate this new reality. 2 years passed from that cold November evening when Marcus had first knocked on Sarah's door, and the Mitchell household had transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The biggest visible change was Emma herself, now a bright and energetic 3-year-old who filled their home with laughter and constant chatter. She had grown from that weak, pale baby into a healthy, thriving child with rosy cheeks, curious eyes, and a personality that charmed everyone she met. The invisible changes were more complex. Sarah and David's marriage had been tested in ways they never anticipated, stretched thin by stress and conflicting priorities, but somehow they had emerged stronger. They had learned to communicate more honestly, to fight fair, and to remember that they were partners even when they disagreed. They had started going to couples counseling about a year earlier, something David had suggested and Sarah had initially resisted, but which had proven invaluable in helping them navigate the complicated emotions surrounding Emma's presence in their lives. Jake was now 10 years old and took his role as big brother to 3 very seriously. He had grown protective not just of Emma but of Lily too, seeming to mature faster than Sarah had expected. He understood in a way that surprised her that their family was different now, that they had chosen to help someone who needed it, and he was proud of that choice. He told his friends at school about his foster sister with a matter-of-fact confidence that made Sarah's heart swell. Lily, now 7, had bonded with Emma in a special way. The two girls shared a room that was painted pale yellow and decorated with both of their artwork. They played together constantly, and Lily had naturally fallen into a nurturing role with Emma, teaching her things and looking out for her. Sometimes Sarah would catch Lily explaining something to Emma with exaggerated patience, clearly mimicking how Sarah spoke to the girls, and it would make her smile even as her eyes filled with tears. The adoption process had been long and emotionally exhausting. Marcus had followed through on his stated intention to voluntarily relinquish his parental rights, a decision that had required multiple court appearances and counseling sessions to ensure he understood the permanence of what he was doing. Sarah had attended several of these hearings, watching Marcus struggle with the decision even as he remained convinced it was the right thing to do. Emma's mother, Jessica, had eventually been located nearly a year after she had disappeared. She was living in another state, working in a restaurant, and trying to rebuild her life. When contacted by Child Protective Services about Emma, Jessica had been honest in a way that was both heartbreaking and admirable. She explained that she had been suffering from severe postpartum depression and had felt like she was drowning, like she was a danger to herself and possibly to Emma. Leaving had felt like the only option at the time. Jessica had agreed to a meeting with Sarah, one that took place in a neutral office with a social worker present. Sarah had been nervous, unsure what to expect, but Jessica had surprised her. She was younger than Sarah had expected, probably only 24 or 25, with tired eyes that held deep sadness. Jessica had asked to see pictures of Emma, and Sarah had shown her dozens on her phone, watching Jessica's face crumble as she saw how much her daughter had grown and changed. Through tears, Jessica had thanked Sarah for saving Emma's life. She acknowledged that she had failed as a mother, that she had abandoned her child when Emma needed her most. But she also explained that she had been so mentally unwell that she truly hadn't felt capable of caring for a baby. She had spent the past year in therapy, on medication for depression and anxiety, and was finally starting to feel like herself again. But she also recognized that too much time had passed, that Emma didn't know her, and that disrupting Emma's stable, loving home would be cruel. Jessica had voluntarily relinquished her parental rights as well, signing the papers with shaking hands while tears streamed down her face. She had asked Sarah for one thing, the possibility of occasional updates on how Emma was doing, maybe pictures a few times a year. Sarah had agreed, understanding that Jessica was trying to do the right thing, even though it was clearly tearing her apart. They had exchanged email addresses, and Sarah had kept her promise, sending photos and brief updates every few months. With both biological parents having relinquished their rights, the path to adoption had opened up. But it still required mountains of paperwork, multiple home visits, court appearances, and seemingly endless waiting. The system moved slowly, grinding through its processes with bureaucratic indifference to the human emotions involved. During this time, Emma remained in foster care with the Mitchells, but the uncertainty weighed on everyone. Finally, on a sunny afternoon in late spring, they all gathered in a courtroom for the adoption finalization hearing. Sarah wore her best dress and had dressed Emma in a beautiful white outfit that made her look like a little angel. David wore a suit, looking more nervous than Sarah had ever seen him during any business presentation. Jake and Lily fidgeted in their nice clothes, excited but not fully understanding the magnitude of the moment. The judge, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, reviewed the case file and then looked at the family gathered before her. She asked Sarah and David a series of questions about their understanding of adoption, their commitment to Emma, and their readiness to be her legal parents in every sense. Both answered with voices thick with emotion, affirming that they were ready, that they wanted this, that Emma was already their daughter in their hearts. Then the judge did something unexpected. She asked if Emma understood what was happening. Emma, only 3 years old, couldn't fully grasp the legal implications, but Sarah had prepared her in age-appropriate terms. Emma stood up in her chair and announced with the confidence only a 3-year-old possesses that Sarah was her mummy, and David was her daddy, and Jake and Lily were her brother and sister, and they were all a family. The courtroom, filled with caseworkers, lawyers, and court staff who had seen this process dozens of times, fell silent at the pure innocence and certainty in Emma's voice. The judge smiled, wiped at her own eyes, and declared that the adoption was finalized. Emma Williams was now officially Emma Mitchell. The family erupted in tears and hugs, and even the usually stoic court staff were smiling and offering congratulations. They celebrated that evening with Emma's favorite meal, chicken nuggets and macaroni and cheese, followed by a cake that Sarah had made herself, decorated with slightly messy frosting flowers that Emma had helped create. It was simple and perfect, exactly what their family needed. Jake gave a toast with his glass of juice, saying he was proud to be Emma's big brother officially now, even though he had always felt like her big brother anyway. Lily added that Emma was the best sister ever, and Emma beamed with happiness at being the center of attention. That night, after the children were all in bed, Sarah found herself in Emma's room, watching the little girl sleep. Emma's breathing was soft and even, her face peaceful in the glow of the nightlight. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate knock on the door, the scared man holding a hungry baby, the months of uncertainty and struggle, the tears and arguments and breakthroughs. She thought about Marcus, who is now out of jail and living in a transitional housing program. He had completed his substance abuse treatment and was working steadily in a warehouse, the same job he had been going to interview for when he was arrested. Sarah had maintained contact with him throughout the adoption process, and Marcus had been supportive, even attending the finalization hearing to show his blessing. He had hugged Sarah afterward, thanking her one more time for giving Emma the life he couldn't provide. The arrangement with Marcus had been carefully negotiated through the courts and with counseling support. He was allowed supervised visits with Emma once a month, visits that took place at a neutral location with a social worker present. These visits were complicated emotionally for everyone. Emma was always confused at first, not understanding who this man was or why he looked at her with such intense emotion. Marcus struggled to hold himself together, to interact with his biological daughter who didn't recognize him as her father. But Sarah believed these visits were important, even though some people in her life had questioned the decision. Emma would have questions as she grew older, would want to know about her biological parents and her origins. Having some connection to Marcus, even a limited one, might help answer those questions someday. Marcus, for his part, seemed to find some peace in seeing Emma happy and healthy, even if it meant accepting that someone else had become her parent. Sarah also thought about the costs this journey had exacted. She and David had spent thousands of dollars between legal fees, the foster care process, and simply supporting Emma. They had depleted their savings and had to delay plans for a vacation they had been dreaming about. Their relationship had been strained to the breaking point at times, and there had been moments when Sarah had genuinely feared they might not make it through intact. Friendships had suffered too. Some of Sarah's friends had been supportive and wonderful, bringing meals and babysitting and offering encouragement, but others had been judgmental, questioning why Sarah would take on someone else's problems, suggesting she was being taken advantage of, or implying that she was neglecting her own children. Some friendships had simply faded away, unable to withstand the disagreement about Sarah's choices. The extended family had been mixed in their reactions. Sarah's mother had been cautiously supportive, though she worried about the burden on Sarah. David's parents had been more openly critical, concerned about the financial impact and the disruption to their grandchildren's lives. Holiday gatherings had been tense for a while, filled with unspoken disapproval and awkward silences. But gradually, as they saw Emma thriving and watched the family adapt, even the skeptics had softened. Emma's infectious personality and genuine sweetness had won over even the most reluctant hearts. As Sarah moved from Emma's room to the bedroom she shared with David, he was already in bed, reading, and he looked up when she entered. They had developed a routine in recent months of talking every night before sleep, reconnecting after the chaos of the day. Sarah climbed into bed beside him, and he put down his book to wrap his arms around her. They talked about the day, about the adoption ceremony, about their relief that the legal uncertainty was finally over. David admitted something he hadn't said before. He had been terrified during the whole process that something would go wrong, that Emma would be taken away after they had all fallen in love with her. Sarah confessed that she had shared that fear, that every knock on the door for months had made her heart race, worried it would be a caseworker with bad news. David also said something that made Sarah cry happy tears. He said that while he had struggled with the decision initially, while there had been times he resented the situation and wished their life had stayed simple, he couldn't imagine their family without Emma now. She had changed them all, he said, had made them more compassionate, more aware of how fortunate they were, more willing to help others. Their children had learned lessons about kindness and sacrifice that couldn't be taught any other way. Sarah fell asleep that night, feeling a sense of completion she hadn't felt in years. The journey that had started with one impulsive act of compassion, feeding a hungry baby, had led to the complete transformation of their family. They were 5 now instead of 4, and while the path had been harder than Sarah could have ever imagined, she wouldn't change it. In the months and years that followed, Emma continued to thrive. She started preschool and made friends easily, her sunny personality drawing other children to her. She showed no signs of developmental delays or emotional trauma from her difficult first months of life. She was smart and curious and loving, calling Sarah Mommy without any confusion or hesitation. The monthly visits with Marcus continued, and as Emma got older, they became less supervised and more comfortable. Marcus had maintained his sobriety and continued working, slowly rebuilding his life. He was always respectful of boundaries, never trying to confuse Emma or claim a role that wasn't his anymore. He brought small gifts and played with Emma during visits, content to be a friendly presence in her life, even if she didn't understand their biological connection. Sarah kept her promise to Jessica as well, sending regular updates with photos. Jessica always responded with gratitude and love, clearly treasuring these small windows into her daughter's life. She had never asked to meet Emma, seeming to understand that doing so might confuse the child, but Sarah had quietly decided that when Emma was older, and if she wanted to meet her birth mother, Sarah would support that. On Emma's 5th birthday, the whole family gathered for a party in their backyard. Sarah watched from the porch as David pushed Emma on the swing set, her delighted squeals filling the air. Jake was organizing a game with the neighborhood kids who had come to celebrate, and Lily was helping arrange the snacks on the picnic table. It was a perfect, ordinary family scene, the kind that happened in backyards across the country every day. But for Sarah, it was extraordinary. She thought about that desperate man who had knocked on her door years ago, begging for help for his starving baby. She thought about the choice she had made in that moment to answer the door, to bring them inside, to feed Emma. That one choice had led to thousands of other choices, big and small, that had brought them to this moment. People sometimes asked Sarah if she regretted her decision, if the sacrifice had been worth it. She always said yes without hesitation. Yes, it had been hard. Yes, it had cost them money and time and energy and emotional well-being. Yes, there had been moments of doubt and fear and frustration, but looking at Emma, healthy and happy and loved, Sarah knew she would make the same choice again in a heartbeat. Because Emma wasn't just a child they had helped, she was their daughter. She was Jake and Lily's sister. She was a permanent part of their family, woven into the fabric of their lives so completely that it was impossible to imagine their family without her. The Mitchells had started as a family of 4, and through an unexpected journey filled with challenges and grace, they had become a family of 5. As the sun began to set on Emma's birthday party, casting golden light across the yard full of playing children and laughing adults, Sarah felt profound gratitude. She was grateful for the knock on her door that had started everything. She was grateful for Marcus's courage in asking for help, and later in letting go. She was grateful for David's willingness to take this journey with her despite his doubts. She was grateful for Jake and Lily's open hearts. And most of all, she was grateful for Emma herself, the little girl who had come into their lives as a stranger's hungry baby and had become their beloved daughter. Their family story was unconventional, complicated, and imperfect, but it was theirs, and it was beautiful.